Growing up in the 1970s and 80s meant that the movies of Sylvester Stallone were a regular part of my entertainment. Some of my early favorites were First Blood and the Rocky franchises, and since most of his films were action-based, they moved over to video games quite regularly. So it was no surprise that 1993's Demolition Man was picked up by Acclaim for a release on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. As you may recall, Demolition Man was a fish-out-of-water tale about John Spartan, a former police officer jailed for inadvertently causing the deaths of 30 hostages at the hands of the evil Simon Phoenix. After being frozen in a cryo prison and waking up in 2032, you find that society has changed dramatically, now a utopia of crimeless existence. Your mission is to apprehend Simon Phoenix once again, who has mysteriously escaped captivity and is even more powerful than before. The developer Alexandria was behind the project, with Acclaim handling the publishing side. It took some time to get it finished, and it didn't show up until January of 1995, 15 months after the film showed up in theaters. The question is, how did it turn out and was it worth the wait? In this episode, we will be looking at Demolition Man for the Sega Genesis and Sega CD, a movie license that might just surprise you. In the cartridge version of Demolition Man, the story is pretty much non-existent. It jumps level to level with little explanation about what's going on. In the Sega CD release, you get full motion video scenes straight out of the movie that explains what is happening and why you are headed to the next stage location. The gameplay and layouts are identical in both cartridge and CD versions. Your shot button fires whatever weapon you happen to be holding at the time. You have a standard handgun that has unlimited ammo, but you can pick up shotguns and magnums as you explore. These last until you exhaust their ammo or pick up another weapon. These weapons can be fired up, down, and diagonally, an important feature since you spend much of the game climbing ladders, ropes, and zip lines. The throw button is for your grenades, of which there are 3 types: frag, fire, and ice. Your jump button is self-explanatory, though it also activates your roll if you press and hold it with down and forward. This can be used to roll under enemy fire. There are side-scrolling sequences and top-down overhead sequences. Both are run and gun in nature, but they play very differently. The side-scrolling portions have bottomless pits you can die in and have fall damage if you drop too far. The overhead stages are typically in a building of some kind and revolve around rescuing hostages. Since you don't jump in these, the jump button is used to fire behind you, or you can hold the jump button to lock your shooting direction while you move. Aside from the guns and grenades I mentioned earlier, there are also health packs you can find to restore life, body armor that temporarily protects you from bullets, extra lives, and finally, infrared goggles to light up dark stages. The heads-up display is as minimalistic as they come. In the lower left corner, you have a life bar and the type of grenades you are currently carrying. That's it. The stages themselves are loosely based on the movie, with 10 in total, with many of them ending in an encounter with Simon Phoenix, where you either fight him or must avoid his devious traps. As you might have guessed, Demolition Man is only one player.
Welcome to the Saturn Museum of History.
Visually, Demolition Man falls in line with other Genesis games like Jurassic Park. It goes for that gritty, dark, semi-realistic feel that has nice animation and varied set pieces. It's almost digitized in how the final image meets your eye. Things are a bit anemic in the backgrounds, with a noticeable lack of deep parallax scrolling. This was a real missed opportunity because some of these locations really needed it. Most of what is here looks pretty decent otherwise, though some areas are overly dark and difficult to navigate. It's all too easy to fall into bottomless pits, fire, or some other insta-death that you just didn't see coming. Performance is another area of concern, because there is quite a bit of slowdown across the various stages. Curiously, I found the Sega CD to have more in this regard, or at least it appeared that way. This was really apparent in the overhead stages where the Sega CD seemed to really suffer. There are times where this isn't an issue at all, but when it does show up, you feel it. Perhaps the biggest letdown is in the Sega CD version, which gets no special sprite scaling stage or additional content outside of its super grainy full motion video cinematics and CD soundtrack. I can't help but to feel that these visuals and the overall performance are a result of the developer trying to lock down two very different graphic styles. Instead of focusing on either the side-scrolling or overhead stages specifically, they wasted valuable time splitting resources. I like what Alexandria did overall, but I think this game could have looked and ran a whole lot better. For those curious, the Super Nintendo version of this game is nearly identical in terms of content, with only a few transparency effects added to the mix and loads more slowdown. Have a look to see what I mean. The cartridge version of Demolition Man uses gems and it gets the job done. There's nothing special here, nothing that will destroy your ears, and the digitized speech actually sounds like the actors themselves. But you know how it is with gems. Some of you tolerate it a lot better than others. The CD version employs Q sound and meets the ear a lot better. I've prepared a few stage comparisons so you can hear the difference. The run and gun nature of Demolition Man means it's gonna have a large appeal to a great many of you, and it deserves that interest. Most of what is here is fast, frantic, and very much in the spirit of the film on which it's based. In many ways, it mirrors the fun seen in games like Earthworm Jim and Terminator CD. You're always on the move, always climbing something, always a breath away from getting yourself killed. There's an attraction to that for adrenaline junkies, and I think they will enjoy this one the most. But there is no question that Demolition Man has some issues that hold it back from greatness. The most glaring is the stage design that punishes newcomers with cheap deaths that can consume your lives and continues at a pretty substantial rate. I'm not talking about enemy placement that needs to be learned, or boss battles that need to be memorized. I'm talking deaths that come from single hits and falls that are genuinely difficult to avoid unless you invest some serious time. Demolition Man isn't a hard game to beat with a little effort from action vets, but it most certainly is a game that will try your patience. Enemies also respawn at an alarming rate. I mean, these dudes are like cockroaches crawling out of the woodwork literally half a second after the screen moves an inch. As you can imagine, this leads to some cheap damage, and even though healing items are plentiful, it's still a frustration. It will also interest you to know that there are 3 difficulties to choose from, and you only get the full game with an ending on 2 of them. On what the game calls calm, or easy, the game ends 3 stages shy of the final boss battle without a resolution of any kind. You have to play normal, or crazed, and above to get all the levels and an ending. The game is significantly more difficult on these settings, limiting both your starting lives and continues to 2 or less. The Sega CD version again lets you down with its lack of exclusive content. The Genesis version came out in early 1995 while the Sega CD edition landed at the very end of that year, sporting only full motion video and a new soundtrack. It was rather surprising considering the amount of time that had passed between the two releases. On a positive note, the CD version does give you the ending of the movie in place of the incredibly brief text at the end of the cartridge. It's a minor victory, but I'll take it. I don't think I need to tell you that during the 16-bit era, a game tied to a live-action movie typically was a death sentence, especially if it had Acclaim on the box. But for all its issues, Demolition Man is still a very playable run-and-gun that has some pretty enjoyable mechanics. Looking back at the media of the time, it scored a lot better than you would have thought, lending some evidence that some genres fare better than others even when there are issues worth noting. GamePro mentioned some of these issues in their review, yet still gave it a 4 out of 5 across the board. Mean Machines in the UK enjoyed it even more, rating it 85 out of 100 with a glowing write-up comparing it to RoboCop vs. Terminator. Game Players was another publication singing its praises as one of the better movie tie-ins you could get at the time. While reading these reviews, I took notice that many of them were done well before the game was officially released. It would seem that the original license holder was Virgin Interactive, who decided to not release the game even though it was finished. This explains it being so late after the movie's fall 1993 debut, and it explains many of the design similarities to a fair number of Virgin's releases. I'm glad Acclaim rescued this and decided to publish it. Again, it has some design issues that frustrate, but overall, this can still be an enjoyable romp through a not so distant future. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.